Hey guys, welcome back to One Room Schoolhouse, and we're going to spend some time getting into the first and second Great Awakening. The reason is, if you look at where we are in America today, there's maybe some reasons to think that we might be in the middle of another Great Awakening. But you have to understand the first and second Great Awakening to really understand the context of why we might think we are in a national revival today. And it'd be an interesting question to ask most Americans, especially for Christians. Because Christians, we believe in the move of God and that God can do a revival, and so some spiritual biblical things we might throw in there. But if we ask most Christians, what would a revival in America look like? If we had another, like first Great Awakening, second Great Awakening, if we had another Great Awakening, what would that look like? Because I don't think most Americans would know the signs of a Great Awakening because we don't really know the signs from the first or second Great Awakening.
Yeah, I think there's a perception that if we have a Great Awakening, all this polarization is going to go away. We'll finally have unity and we'll agree and get along, and we won't see the kind of riots and we won't see the silliness going on that we see and have seen now for a number of years. And so I think there's a perception that it's finally a time where we can go, peace at last. People finally see the truth. They understand, they get it. And yet that's never been the way any revival in American history has gone. And by the way, even the revivals in the Bible with Asa and King Jehoshaphat and King Josiah, where there were really moves of God at that time, none of them brought that fruit. So it would be an interesting question if you just ask the person on the street, says, if we had a revival in America, what do you think America would look like at the end of that revival? And probably what they think it looks like is going to be nowhere close to what it will look like when a revival actually happens. And again, we think there's great historical reason to believe, based on the fruits we're seeing now, that we're probably in a Great Awakening. And that's probably something to point out, is Great Awakenings tend to span decades. Somehow we think if we can just have a revival, it's all going to be fixed and clean really, really quickly, and that's just not the case. The first Great Awakening is a transgenerational movement that went from 1730 thereabouts to about 1770. They say the second Great Awakening goes maybe from 1801 to the 1870s. In Virginia, they say it starts a few years earlier, like 1790. So, I mean, the times are indefinite, but it does span decades. So it's not like you instantly see a change and people are different and finally we can say, look, that's a revival. It has never worked that way.
Yeah, and one of the things too, that mentioning perception that people have of maybe the awakenings from previous generations, the first Great Awakening, second Great Awakening, not only do we lose the context that this went on for decades, it's also interesting that this was not a national revival per se. If you go to the first and second Great Awakening, now certainly there were national leaders at times. At the first Great Awakening, we know the name George Whitefield. We actually have several original sermons from George Whitefield. We also have an original letter from George Whitefield. So cool. Yeah, a lot of really cool things from some very noted people from American history. All that being said, what's significant about guys like a George Whitefield is they certainly were nationally recognized figures. And in the first Great Awakening, George Whitefield traveled all over America. He had 7 missionary journeys, so to speak, almost like the Apostle Paul in the Bible had multiple missionary journeys. The Apostle Paul, go forward, George Whitefield, like this is what he's doing. He was starting in Georgia, going to Maine, and Maine to Georgia, and he was going back and forth. He had 7 missionary journeys in America, and it's estimated that throughout the many years of these missionary journeys, nearly 80% of Americans physically heard him speak. So certainly you would say, okay, so George Whitefield, a national guy in the first Great Awakening. If you go past George Whitefield, you could point to people like Gilbert Tennent, Jonathan Edwards. You could go to some individual pastors, but most pastors in the first Great Awakening who were notable pastors, they were influential in their communities. They weren't influential nationally. And here's kind of the point, is we often think of a revival as a national movement. It actually doesn't have generally the big national movement feel that we think. It generally is much more related to local movement, local revivals. It just so happens there were so many local movements, local revivals, it felt national, but really it was much more of a community effort.
It was a community effort, and that, as you point out, George Whitefield, it's estimated 80% of Americans physically heard him speak. Think about the technology back then. You have to be in the crowd to hear him speak, which means he had to be in like 80% of the communities in America for them here. So it was a series of local revivals. And as you mentioned, Gilbert Tennant, who was really big in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. You have Samuel Cooper, who was really big in the Boston area. And you have Samuel Davies, who was really big in the valleys of Virginia. I mean, there's noted leaders, but there's revivals in each of these areas. Now, when you have revivals in that many communities, you have a national revival, but it wasn't because it was a national revival. It was there were so many local revivals that it became a national revival. And that's the way the Second Great Awakening and others were as well. And so the focus really is not on looking at the nation, it's looking at my community. And that's what Whitefield did. He would come into town and preach to 50 people here or 500 people here. He'd go to Philadelphia, he'd have 10,000. I mean, he went community to community. And it's an indication of that in the Second Great Awakening. Kind of a parallel guy would be Francis Asbury. And it's estimated that Francis Asbury rode between 300 and 400,000 miles on horseback. Now you take
it's a long way to ride.
It's a long way to ride. You take, and essentially what you're doing there, that's considered about 16 times around the world that Asbury rode on horseback, except he did it all in America, community to community. And that's what Whitefield's doing, those 7 missionary journeys. It's not like going from here to Maine. It's like here, touch every community I can between here and Maine, come back, touch every community I can. And that's how you get 80% of Americans physically hear him preaching. But as you said, it's not a national movement. It's a bunch of local fires that become a national bonfire.
And one of the things that signified the First Great Awakening, we mentioned that there was a lot of challenge to the existing status quo of theology, of biblical interpretation. And one of the things that significantly led to the First Great Awakening actually goes back to the 1600s, back to the 1660s arguably. And it was something that a group of Puritan leaders decided they wanted to do something to help the church, because in 1660 they apparently had a dwindling congregation, and one of the requirements back then to go to church was you had to have a profession of faith. So you had to be a Christian professing your belief in Jesus, and you had to have been baptized. Now, already that's a lot different than the way church happens today. For most churches today, we're trying to bring in people who know nothing about God, know nothing about Jesus, have never been baptized. We want them to come to church, and it's much more of a seeker-friendly environment in modern culture. Well, that's kind of what they did back in the 1660s. They created what's called the Halfway Covenant, and the Halfway Covenant said, instead of having to have both a profession of faith and have been baptized to come to church, what if we just say if maybe you've ever been baptized, if you were baptized as an infant, then you now can come to church. And they were trying to find a way to grow the church without having people necessarily believe in Jesus to come. Well, this happened in the 1660s. And you go forward several decades, you get into the early 1700s, and there are now people who are pastoring churches who do not have a profession of faith. They maybe have been in church for a while. They've heard a lot of sermons, but they don't have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Now that's boggling to think about, although we could think of a few ministers today that we might question if they really have a relationship with God or not based on some of their theological positions. But here's the point. The Halfway Covenant was a movement to be much more seeker-friendly, and they got away from theological biblical truth. So back up to the 1720s, there was a call from ministers in very specific local congregations, denominations, saying, guys, we need to get back to what the Bible says. This was the movement of the First Great Awakening. But anytime you challenge the existing theological status quo, there's going to be pushback by people saying, wait a second, you can't change what we've been doing for decades or for years or what we believe to be morally right or true, even though they could point to the Bible and say, but wait a second, guys, here's biblical truth, what we should be following. It's interesting that we've mentioned that there was a lot of division among especially the church over things happening in the First Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening too, but the First Great Awakening, there was a lot of political, religious frustrations as people were making a move to say, guys, here's what the Bible actually says.
Yeah, as you look at that First Great Awakening time frame in the 1720s and 30s, as it really starts turning biblical, there's no question America was a deeply religious country. Doesn't mean they were biblical. They were religious. Religion was really important. And it was so important that as you go through the various colonies, and there were denominations that were bigger in some colonies than others. If you go into Virginia, it was the Anglicans who really kind of ran Virginia, and the Congregationalists who really kind of ran Massachusetts and New Hampshire and places like that. And you get to the Quakers in Pennsylvania. They're really pretty jealous for their own religious traditions. And so literally...
By the way, jealous were meaning very defensive.
Yes.
Okay, so there wasn't a lot of unity back then. Today, we like to think of denominations and thinking that, hey, we got to be able to work together. If there's different churches in the community, they ought to work together to help reach the community, to make a difference for the people around them. We think much more in terms of unity on some level. Back then, many of the denominations that were being formed in America, or religious communities, they had escaped persecution in Europe, where they were persecuted for their faith oftentimes. So they came and established communities for people of their own denomination, their own religious preference, and they didn't want somebody else coming in and tell them how they needed to live their life religiously, their life of faith, or their biblical interpretation, because they had gone through persecution in Europe. They didn't want that again in America. So they got very defensive. If anybody else tried to tell them about faith, they didn't want to hear any of that. In the midst of them being defensive, there was actually a lot of conflicts between denominations.
There was. These religious people who all claim some allegiance to Jesus Christ and all claim that the Bible is the authority for their existence. As you, for example, if you were a Quaker missionary coming into a place like Virginia, 2 Christians, right? Just denominations. Yeah, except the Anglicans in Virginia were killing Quaker missionaries, and they were taking Baptist missionaries and imprisoning them, and taking Methodist and Presbyterian missionaries and fining them. And I mean, they were really brutal to other Christians. And the colonies themselves, man, it's like, this is my colony, you stay in your colony. You even had wars that lasted for over a decade between colonies over their borders, over their lines. So, I mean, it really was a contentious time, but it was all in the guise of religion. And I think, as you mentioned, Tim, we hear so many ministers today being religious but not being biblical. And that's really what was happening then. And we have a good friend, George Barna. We do a lot of work with George Barna, but he's identified that there's about 384,000 churches and senior pastors in America. And he was calling about 500 a day, just asking basic questions, and found that about 72% of current ministers in America disagree with some of the most fundamental teachings of the Bible, which is why you can have a U.S. senator who is a Baptist minister saying, oh, God wants abortion. God doesn't want marriage between a man and a woman. I mean, it's like, no. The Bible is so clear. Welcome to the First Great Awakening.
Right, on Easter Sunday, right, when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and this U.S. senator sends out a tweet over the weekend that says, guys, you can earn your own salvation. Don't just focus on Jesus, just be a good person. You can do enough good to be saved. That's the exact opposite of what the Bible says. Yeah. But this again is where so often because we don't know really the history of the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, we don't see the religious divisions that were happening. We think of the Great Awakenings as a time that brought peace and unity to America. And on some level, it did bring unity to groups of people, right? It brought unity among enough colonies in the First Great Awakening that it emboldened many of the founding fathers to stand up and be unified amongst themselves in a fight for freedom and liberty to separate from Great Britain. But not all Americans were unified on that. In fact, maybe only about a third of Americans held that position. If you go to the Second Great Awakening, we have this idea that there was unity among Christians. Well, not really. Right? There was great division among different denominations. Different denominations had splits during the Second Great Awakening over the issue of slavery, for example. Not all Christians agreed, but it did unify enough Christians around biblical truth that it led to some of these great abolition movements and other things going on. The point is, when we look historically, the First and Second Great Awakening, the ideas that we have in America today maybe are not historically justified, because historically there was great division, and yet there was a move to restore biblical truth and challenge some of the existing status quo. That's something that we are seeing happen over the last couple of years in America, that there is a movement of Christians standing up saying, guys, we need to defend some of these basic biblical issues, whether it be with gender identity or human sexuality or religious liberty, things the Bible is very clear on, and that's only one of many examples we could point to. But in the midst of looking back at the First Great Awakening, we mentioned George Whitefield, a national leader, so to speak. Although it wasn't a national movement for a revival, it was local revivals, local movements, people getting involved locally, stirred up locally. They were doing things to make a difference. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn, a lot of application we can make from the first and second great awakening. So we're going to spend some time going through the first and second great awakening. Now, if you want to learn more about the first great awakening, we talk about this some in our book, The American Story. There's also other resources on our website, wallbuilders.com, that you can find out more about the first and second great awakening, and really, what does that mean for us as Christians now? What lessons can we learn? Maybe, is there evidence we can point to that might indicate we maybe are in a third great awakening? We're going to spend time getting into more of this as we do more of these episodes on One Room Schoolhouse. We'll see you next time.